In the United States, few major cities are as defined by history as Boston, especially with its inventory of old buildings. They materialize history, but also its flux and revision. Above all, they engage us in stories about people, even those who were overlooked by history in an earlier draft. That's why it helps to have a book on these buildings from the perspective of an archaeologist. Published by Brandeis University Press, it's called Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them. We'd like to welcome the author, who's also the city's archaeologist, Joseph Bagley. Thank you very much for being with us, Joseph.
Thanks for having me.
Joseph, I want to ask you about the overall intent of this book, because we've had other books before about old buildings in Boston. You would think there's maybe nothing new to say, but right at the beginning of this book, you have a quotation. I think it's in reference to the Old South Meeting House, but I guess that sort of states the purpose. What was this purpose?
So the quote really speaks about the identity of Boston as an historic place, and that the buildings, the old buildings here that the city still preserves, really creates this identity that's known within the actual city itself. It's why people want to live here. It's why people come to see Boston. That if these buildings are lost, what part of the city is being lost with these buildings if we lose them?
I want to go to the part of the title here that you added, which made me wonder why did he put that in? I mean, the oldest buildings and where to find them. I mean, what is this about finding an old building and I guess knowing how old it really is?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book was to make sure that folks understand that the history of Boston and the older houses in Boston are not just in downtown. So a goal of the book was to do a complete survey of the city across the entire boundaries, to make sure that we are inclusive of all the neighborhoods. And one of my surprises while doing the research for the book was just how many neighborhoods in Boston included houses from the youngest building in the book is 1794, and yet there's still numerous buildings throughout the city, in various neighborhoods that are included in that list, that I wasn't expecting to be doing research on places in Rosendale and places in Mattapan, which is the neighborhood I live in. And the research that goes into establishing those dates was so critical because it had never been done. No one had done a survey across the entire city to be inclusive of every building in the city of Boston, and to really nail down as tightly as possible the dates of construction for these buildings, which required quite a bit of research.
I'm originally from Dorchester, and I never even knew about the Blake House or that it was the oldest surviving building in the city until it was shown off to me by someone who was originally from New Jersey. What's special about the Blake House?
Oh God, so many things are special about the Blake House. It's not just one of the oldest buildings in the city; it's one of the oldest buildings in the entire country. It was built in the 1660s. Definitively, it was dated through looking at the actual wood. It's a rare style of construction. It was done from west of London structure, which means that there was the amount of wood that was used in the building is fairly unique. And when you see the building, it feels kind of modest by today's standards and scale. It's basically the scale of a standard colonial house, colonial Cape house in that you can see on the Cape. But when it was first built, it was originally the size that it currently is, which by those standards in the 1660s, it was a mansion, a massive house. And many of the houses from the 1600s and 1700s in this book actually start off with significantly smaller buildings that grow over time. In fact, the Blake House was bigger at one point, but they've removed pieces of it over time, especially when they moved it down the street, literally dragged it down the street in Dorchester to move it to where it currently is in the park.
Well, we tend to think of buildings as functional. They provide shelter, maybe comfort. But when people are putting up a building, there's also sort of, I guess, a mental model they're working from. It's a statement. And I guess even with the Blake House, I guess that might have applied too, right?
Yeah, people always make statements with what they do. They make statements with the products that they buy and wear. That's one of the things I'm interested in as an archaeologist. And they make statements to the public when they build houses. One of my lines for archaeology, it's not about the stuff, it's about the story. And it's the same thing with buildings. It's really not about the architectural style. It's about the story that portrays. And so when you see the changes in the architecture in the building as you go from the oldest buildings to the more recent ones, and what you actually see is a change from people essentially attempting to survive in a foreign land to them, to making statements, whether it be a Georgian style house that's really meant to show solidity and strength and scale, and deliberately putting houses on top of fake hills to make them look even taller, to federal style houses where this new country that is a couple of years old, really referencing ancient Greece and these kind of more stately style architectural buildings to establish an American identity, an American solidity in a new country. And all of these things change over time. And you can kind of see these statements being made by people, whether they're trying to show off their wealth or show off their ability to use a specific type of material, or some of the more modest houses, which were just simply houses to live in and survive just because they're so useful over time.
Well, where there is wealth, there was slavery for quite a while, even before the War of Independence. And I keep noticing that in your book. It keeps turning up over and over again. This is a house, they had slaves doing work there, they were quartered there. Um, did, what was that like for you, sort of stumbling across that over and over again?
Yeah, I mean, it is stumbled upon in the sense that like it's not in every building, but it is in some buildings. But when I set out to write this book, I had a goal in mind to make sure that folks that were being traditionally erased from the histories of Boston are included in this book. So, for example, the photography throughout the book, I have almost no photos of adult white men in the book. There are predominantly photos of women, children, and minorities. It is a conscious choice that I made to make sure that the stories that were told in the book were inclusive. And one of the ways to do that is to be sure to check into, are the people that live in these houses enslaved? Are the people that own these houses enslavers? Are they complicit in the slave trade? And to make sure that that is at least acknowledged throughout the book. So there are houses in the book that were lived in and built for free Black people, but there also are houses in the book who were built for people who were enslavers or built by people who profited greatly at the expense of enslavement. So that was part of the important inclusive story and history that I wanted to make sure was included in this book.
Another part of the story is that there seems to be a sort of a life cycle for these buildings where at one point they're important, they're useful, then they're neglected, they're run down, they're almost scheduled for demolition, and then there's a rescue. I mean, that's another thing I come across repeatedly, including with Old South Meeting House. Right.
Yeah, many of the buildings that appear in the book are here because of a great deal of effort went into keeping them here, despite a threat, whether it be through just plain neglect or through actual scheduled demolition. Few of the buildings were saved by the Boston Landmarks Commission through landmark process and demolition delays. There's other buildings, like one of my favorite ones in Mattapan, the Elijah Jones House. It's a small house. It got moved from the street in order to build a larger three-decker. And where it got placed, it was amongst other smaller houses from the 1950s. And even though it's from the 1780s, it just fits into the neighborhood. So it's almost like people forgot to tear it down because it just fit nicely into the scope of the houses around it. It's not at a risk of development. But many of these houses are built on, and not all of them are houses, but many were built on extremely large lots. And the placement of the houses further from the street, which was very commonplace in the 17 and 1800s, meant that a lot of these houses had large land areas around them, especially in front of them. And that made a lot of these buildings targets in later time periods as density. We need density in urban development. We need to have more buildings. And a lot of these buildings were placed in lots that had a lot of open space, and those became targets for additional development. Some of the solutions were to move buildings to get them out of the way or move them further either in the back of the lots or forward in the lots. But in a lot of the older buildings in Boston, the solution was to tear them down for development that was able to fill the space more efficiently and to make better use of that land for people to live in.
Of course, one of the other photos I liked in the book, it's not that far back in history, actually. It's a shot of Byron Rushing standing in front of the Dillaway Thomas house back when it was practically an abandoned building. What's the context of that?
So Byron Rushing was extremely critical in the process of getting the Dillaway Thomas house saved and rescued. In the 1970s, it was actually a victim of arson. And I think the photograph was soon after the arson attempt of Byron in the process of trying to save the building. And I believe you can even see the burn marks on the building behind that. But Byron is a preservationist and has done great things for the preservation of old buildings in Roxbury and beyond. And I wanted to make sure that he was visually credited in the story of the Dillaway Thomas for the work that he did to save that building. Today, it's a showcase building. It was recently restored again. I think it reopened in 2019 or 2018, and it's now a house museum, beautifully restored by DCR, and has actually quite a few artifacts from the archaeology program in it now. But it's really a testament to people's ongoing efforts to maintain these buildings, but most importantly, keep these buildings relevant to the places where they are. Um, there's no good use for a gigantic mansion in an urban area where there's dense need for more residents, unless we can make these buildings relevant, either through adaptively using them for more housing or make them somehow a resource for the community. The point of preservation shouldn't be just preserving things that are old for the sake of them being old. It's because they capture these stories of the time that things were, but also we need to make sure that they are adapted to be useful to today's community, because that's really ultimately what preservation is for. It's not strictly preserving something, but to make it relevant and useful, and to acknowledge its relevance and its use in the past.
Well, thank you very much for giving just a small portion of what's on the list and all of those stories that are connected to them. Joseph, if people want to get a copy of this or find it online somewhere, what's the best thing for them to do?
You can order it directly from the publisher, Brandeis University Press, but on their webpage, they have links to different ways to buy it through independent bookstores, online retailers, and it's also available at local bookstores.
Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It was Joseph Bagley, the author of Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them. We'll have more news in just a moment.